All right. Hey, YouTube audience. We're going to get started with recording episode 13. And my voice is a little raspy because apparently in the middle of summer you can still catch a cold. But I persevere and I power through it. And I'm still going to record this episode, which is going to be just fantastic. So here we go. Welcome back to Finding Your Identity. This is episode 13. It's going to be about reading and how reading is fundamental. And I know that's super cheesy, but I do want to try to emphasize that it can be really fun. And I think it's kind of silly to think that we stop encouraging reading after you grow up. You know, we spend a lot of time trying to encourage children to read, and we've got all these reading programs for children, and we're really spending a lot of time, making sure that children, and I say children, it's essentially children kindergarten through high school, even, into college, I guess, but younger people, mainly it's children, through elementary school, I think up until middle school, there's a lot of emphasis on reading because there's required books you have to read, like To Kill a Mockingbird and Of Mice and Men and Where the Red Fern Grows, and I think those are some of the staples. Is it like some Stephen King? Is that mandatory elementary school reading? No, I'm just kidding. But it doesn't need to stop there. I feel like that's kind of where I'm gonna pick up where the teachers left off, and hang tight, because what I'm really trying to do is get people to kind of have a feel for reading as something that's enjoyable and not a chore. And I think that's kind of the first step, is really getting past it being a chore, because that often will discourage people from doing anything, as if they feel like it's a chore. So I think this is why I wanted to do a podcast episode about it. And I think to start off, I'm going to kind of go through some of the statistics that I found when I just started researching reading. The average number of books in the U.S. that is read by Americans is 12. So the average American reads about 12 books per year. And that's kind of a general statistic, but that's encompassing the avid readers and the heavy readers. So what it really is about 4. It's more like 4 for the mass population. And when you start to kind of zoom out and you start to see who's doing the reading, you'll find that the majority of readers are females. There's a lot more female readers out there than the male readers. And I'm going to take a guess at this because I didn't actually look up the statistic, but I'm going to say that's probably maybe 25 and older, maybe 30 and older. But, I feel like that statistic probably goes higher when you get into your 30s, 40s, 50s, that more females are reading. It just happens to be one of those common things. But, the interesting thing is that there's still, it's not just women, it's obviously men. It's probably like 60-40 or 55-45 or something like that, so it's not like it's skewed where there's 90% of women in the country are reading, and or 90% of the readers are women, and only 10% are men. It's nothing like that, but it just happens to be that there's just a lot more females. I guess that maybe that kind of register on surveys or something like that. And I belong to this website called Goodreads, and it's got an app too, and it's for tracking the books that you're reading. It's kind of great because you can log what you want to read, you can log what you're currently reading, and you can log what you've read. and it keeps this kind of running record. And only recently did I start actually actively recording to it. I used to go to it for over the past couple years for recommendations and to read reviews about books, but I came across, some article that I read that, that said it actually kind of helps to track it because it's something that it's making you, be more conscious about your reading habits. And there's also the Kindle app, which has Amazon Reading Insights or Kindle Insights or something to that effect. It just kind of pops up as my Reading Insights. I don't know if that's just the generic name, but that also will let you know how many times you read this week, especially if you're reading on a Kindle device daily or weekly or monthly. It'll pop up and it'll say, these are what your reading insights for the week were, and you can look and see, I happened to open the Kindle app and it says that I read 3 times this week. And, I think sometimes that little notification kind of kicks me in the pants and says, oh, hey, I've only read 3 times this week. I should be reading every day because I want to read at least a couple pages every day. And I think it actually is kind of cheap. I think you could actually open the app up and literally just look at a page for about 10 seconds, not read anything, and then close it, and that could actually register it. But the fact that you're consciously going through the steps, most likely you're going to be reading at least a few pages. Sometimes I'll open it up and I'll read 1 page for the day. Sometimes I'll open it up and I'll read 50 pages for the day. Depends. Or, maybe throughout the day I'm opening it up and reading like 2, 3, 4 pages, and then 10 pages later, and then 3 pages now. But it's nice to track it. And so Goodreads also provides an insight from a more holistic reading perspective, because you can put what you've read, you can put the things that you have on your list that you want to read and what you're currently reading, and you can actually put percentage done. If anyone else is like me, where I tend to start multiple books, the majority of the time, just 2 books at a time. I usually start a nonfiction book and a fiction book. I'll have 2 of them going at the same time. And you can actually put in percent done into Goodreads so you can kind of see there. Although generally, if it's just 2 books that you're working on, it shouldn't be too hard to remember your progress. And you can kind of tell, well, I'm 60 pages in and it's 400 pages, so I'm barely cracking 5-10% of this thing. But I think just that tracking is helpful. Lets you kind of have this sense of completing something and completing the goal of reading a book or 2 per whatever set period, whether that's every 2 weeks, weekly, if you're super ambitious. If you could read 1 book every week, and there's, 52 weeks in a year, and, you wanted to try to read 2 books a week, actually, not just 1 book a week, because you wanted to read 100 books in 1 year, you'd be kind of cranking out books like crazy. That's pretty much, I think, 3.5 days. Every 3.5 days, you're starting a book and finishing it within 3.5 days. If you wanted to read 100 books per year, but if you just wanted to read 52 books in 1 year or 50 books in 1 year, that's still, you got to consider, you got to be reading a book per week. So that could generally be kind of hard. So I think a lot of people maybe have a goal of, reading in the different lengths of books actually come into play. So you have to consider if the average book that you're reading, because of what you generally pick up, based off your likes, is between 250 pages and 450 pages, the 250 page book, is obviously going to take you less time. So, maybe this month you've got that 250 page book, and, you could potentially pick that thing up and crank it out in like 6 days or something like that, maybe even like 4 days. However long it takes you to actually complete it, is irrelevant. I think what it comes down to is setting goals for yourself. I think it's considered part of working on yourself. That's why I'm going to include it in this Working on Yourself series. But I think a lot of it is just, it's a personal goal. It's something that you feel is going to help better you, because reading has a lot of benefits, a lot of cognitive benefits. I think that if you actually stop and think about if there's been a long period of time since the last time you've actually read something, think about when the last time that you read something was. And if it's been a while, you got to kind of consider, well, why? Why haven't I picked up something and read? Now, I think there's a difference, obviously, between reading the news, reading a newspaper, reading a magazine, reading tweets or Facebook posts. I mean, you could always say, I read every day, but I'm thinking I want to separate that out as a different genre, or not even genre, but a whole different type of reading in general, because I think there's something to be said about reading what I'd call snippets of information, which is what a lot of our news is delivered as in this day and age, so I think it's important to kind of distinguish. And since it's delivered in these smaller snippets and it's consumed almost independently of other things, because you're switching gears in your brain, if you really think about it, when you read a news story about something local, like a car accident or a fire, or, sometimes there's an occasional happy story about how they saved a puppy from a lake when it fell through the ice in the middle of winter, or something like that. And then they found it a new home and it got adopted, and that's super great. And there's, a happy ending there. And then you're switching gears to national news and you hear about Iranian terrorists, or even just the Iranians, taking over some boat in the middle of the ocean that turns out to be a British oil rig. Or you hear about the new British Prime Minister that got elected. Whatever it is, you're jumping around. You're jumping around between topics. I mean, that's my main point, is that it's not a consistent experience, and your brain is switching gears and processing that information somewhat differently for each of those topics and that each of those chunks of information. So that being said, reading an entire novel, and what if it's fiction, or reading a nonfiction book from beginning to end, it has a consistent theme and it's got a consistent tone to it. The information is relatively consistent, and it's something that is building your knowledge base, most likely from the nonfiction book. Even in fiction books, you could be learning about something like that. There's historical fiction, even some sci-fi fiction. You might be learning about a new world, but whatever it is, it's something that's extended. You're learning it over a period of hours, days, weeks, months, whatever it is, however long you're reading that for, but you're consuming it in a pattern that's from the beginning with the middle and an end, and it's giving you the whole picture, and it's building your base knowledge in your brain that way. And so my opinion is that that's consuming information differently, and it's working towards you're educating yourself differently than when you're reading just snippets. I mean, granted, like, you're learning current events and you're potentially learning about global warming, or you're learning about something that's causing a new Ebola outbreak in the Congo, or whatever it is. You're kind of finding out some of the details. You might be reading a very thorough article about why this Ebola strand is more powerful than the last Ebola strand, and why it's affecting more people, and why it's spreading so rapidly. Or you're reading about people who were ignorant and didn't vaccinate their children, and did I just inject an opinion? Yes. But obviously they were operating on misinformation about not vaccinating children. Anyways, vaccinations are important. You're reading an article about that, and you are being educated. You're reading an article that is educating you that all the information that was about vaccines causing some kind of problem in children was based off of false studies or false information, and was spread, and the misinformation was spread so rapidly that it actually got to a dangerous level of people believing something that they shouldn't really have been believing. And it caused the state of New York, for instance, to institute laws and ordinances that are essentially preventing people who aren't vaccinated from going to certain public places. But that, to me, it's in a smaller chunk. Now, there's long form articles, there's short stories, there's all different types of things you can read. And I think all of that's important. What I'm trying to focus though here is it's the discipline of reading a book from start to finish that I'm really trying to emphasize, because I think that in itself is important for growing yourself, because you're committing to something that I think is important. You're having the discipline to do it regularly, daily, every other day, weekly, monthly, whatever it is. You're building a schedule around it. And I think this is forming a good habit and good patterns in your daily life cycle, or daily routine, I think was the word I was looking for. And that's what's important. And so I think it's also important to look at reading as something that's fun and enjoyable, so that it's not a chore as a part of your routine. Like exercising to me is kind of a chore, although I do enjoy it when I have the time to do it. I just find it doesn't seem to fit in my schedule as easily as reading. And so right now, it's kind of what I'm talking about. So reading, fitting in the schedule, is I try to read a few pages every night before I go to bed. If I can throughout the day. On the weekends, I have a little bit more time, so I try to read a little bit more. But I make it a habit. But I've gotten to the point where I really love reading, and I want to devour books. And I love when I'm into a good story, and you can't really beat the feeling of being immersed in a story that is so captivating that you don't want to put it down and you want to just continue reading it. I mean, it's just a very enjoyable feeling. And I think part of getting to that point is really understanding what your tastes are when it comes to reading. I personally am not big into science fiction, so I generally stay away from that. I like some historical fiction. I've liked historical fiction about World War II. There's The Book Thief, which is probably one of the most well-known World War II novels that is just highly accredited as a very good, well-written book. I think that was a book that one of my friends put me onto, and it really got me addicted to that kind of genre. And I ran down and I was reading, I think it was called The Book of Lost Things, and then City of Thieves, and these were books that were all kind of similar, in a similar vein, that happened during this World War II era, and they were great. They couldn't somewhat, I mean, they almost could hold a candle, I guess, to The Book Thief, but they were just great books that I got into and I just really loved. But then I started to kind of look into, like, Ready Player One came up on my list to read, and I really enjoyed that. And then I ran down this path of, well, what the heck is like that? I found this book called The Impossible Fortress that was somewhat similar, but not really. But it was a librarian. I actually found, and I should pause for a second, catch my breath. The library is a great resource, one of the greatest resources for just getting back into it or continuing into reading, because you can tap professionals about books. And so, I wanted to find something similar to that Ready Player One book, and this is probably about 6 months before the movie had come out. And I finished that book, and I was just like, I want to find another book. And I wanted something similar to that. And I'm just noting that I read the book before the movie came out. I like to do that. I like to challenge myself. If I know a movie's coming out, I like to actually challenge myself to read a book before it hits the movie theater, because I tend to not want to read it after I've seen it in film. There was Life of Pi was a book that the movie came out, but I wouldn't see it until I finished the book, and I set out to go read it, and I read the book, and then I actually didn't go watch the movie because I heard it was kind of different. But I mean, everyone's always kind of got that same mantra that the book's always better than the movie. And to some degree that could be true. I think Ready Player One was an excellent book. I also thought Ready Player One, the movie, was different enough that it was an excellent movie. And it was a little disappointing to see that it kind of changed some of the big things that to me were very important in the book. But that always happens. And I think if a movie can pull off enough differences and create its own identity, to use my own term, if the movie can kind of create its own identity and separate it from the book, then I think it's doing a good job. And then it's not really cutting into the value that the book provided. And I think the value is that the book is still great to read on its own, and seeing the movie doesn't ruin anything about the book, and vice versa. Reading the book, well, I shouldn't say that. Reading the book kind of does ruin some stuff about the movie, because you watch the movie with this expectation of something that doesn't kind of pan out the same way. But I definitely say, either one of those are good guidelines, I guess, to say. I think what I'm trying to say is that if you put it in front of yourself to make a challenge to yourself to read a book before a movie comes out, I think you should do it, because I think you have the opportunity. But if a movie comes out, or you never knew there was even a book based off of it, like I saw this movie called Into the Wild, and then I heard that there was based on a book, and now it's on my list to go read because it was an interesting movie, and I'm really curious to see how the book turned out. And it's kind of working backwards in that case, but it's perfectly all right to kind of operate that way. Now, I think one of the things that to me is important is finding what you like. Otherwise, there's no enjoyment in it. If it feels like work, again, it feels like a chore, you're not going to be into it. But also, you're less likely to be into it enough to kind of read at a good pace. That if you've got a goal to read 52 books in a year, you really need to line up some solid books for at least the first 6 months, because if you finish a book and then you're spinning your wheels trying to get into another book, and then that takes you 2 weeks or a month, now there you go, you just threw off your whole rhythm, and that'd be unfortunate. But a lot of times what I do is I leverage Goodreads. I've got a nice queue sitting there for me to go read. I've got a queue sitting in my Kindle. I've preloaded a bunch of books onto my Kindle, because it could come to a point where all of a sudden I'm just not into this one story. And my example of that is the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, because I just happened to really want to get into it for some reason. Read The Gunslinger, was great, and then read The Drawing of the Three, which took a little bit longer but was good. And then I jumped into The Wastelands, and for some reason I just couldn't dig my heels into it, partly because I started to hear some things about how the whole overall series kind of peters out a little bit. But I've heard from a close friend of mine that I should at least get through 4, because 4 is probably one of the best ones. Now, this is opinion, and I guess I'll find out. But that being said, I've had Wasteland sitting in my queue for about a year and have read many other books around it. I'll finish a book, and then I'll try to get back into it. And, maybe I'll get another 20% of it read, and then hit a point where then I'm thinking, I just can't, for whatever reason, continue this. And then I jump into my next book that's in my queue. And I think that's fine. I think the point is if you make it a point, I'm going to read every day and not read just commercial garbage that you might be seeing on the internet that's being force fed to you through social media networks, but something that is solid and actually serves a decent purpose in terms of your personal growth, then I'd say that's fine. Skip around. Sometimes it takes a little bit. I mean, there's a rule of thumb. I think some people say 50 pages, some people say 100 pages, but some people say you got to read at least 100 pages of a book to really see if you're going to like it or not, and to really get to the meat of something. I just read a book called The Silent Patient, and I want to say that it was 300 pages before it really got me to go, oh, this is good. It was good, but it took quite a long time for it to hit the point where I went, wow, this is really good. And I really actually got into The Silent Patient because I read Dark Matter, and Dark Matter was written by Blake Crouch, and Dark Matter was an excellent book. And I think I found out about Dark Matter when I was trying to find a book similar to Ready Player One, got into that book, devoured that book because that book was just fantastic, and then happened to get a Goodreads newsletter because I had Dark Matter sitting in my list of books that I read, and I guess Goodreads kind of data mined me a little bit, which I'm okay with, and saw that I had read that book and enjoyed it and reviewed it and gave it a high review, and I got a newsletter, and it was Blake Crouch talking about The Silent Patient, saying how much he enjoyed that book. And I thought, for somebody who wrote Dark Matter, which to me has a pretty significant and solid twist built into the plot line and into that story, I thought, well, The Silent Patient must have something, because otherwise I don't know why he would recommend it, or I'd be really disappointed in him if I got to the end of it and I went, why did he recommend this? Because it didn't really have the same juice that I thought it was going to have. But it was good, and it was a solid recommendation, and I really enjoyed it. Now, that's my personal preferences on books, and I mentioned a couple, and I don't think that's really what matters here. I want to hit you with a quick fact before I get into some of the nitty gritty of why I think reading is important, but they're estimating, and this is Google, of course, estimating that there's 130 million books in existence, which I thought the number would have been in the billions. So that number kind of surprised me. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily every single book that's being accounted for, or that must be every book that has an ISBN number, which is the number that they need to register with the Library of Congress in order to be published or officially published as a book. Possibly that's what it is. There may be tons of books that were not handwritten, but before the printing press, that were written and possibly just printed or written out in multiple ways that were then distributed that aren't counted in that figure. Not entirely sure, but I thought that number was interesting when I just Googled how many books are there in the world, and that number was around 130 million. And it's a little bit higher now with more recent data, but that was kind of interesting. Now, I think... Okay, so let's get into some of the juiciness of this episode. When I call juicy, I'm talking about what are the benefits of reading. What has reading ever done for me to be so great? That's what you want to know, right? Well, there are several cognitive benefits and mental health benefits. It's, first and foremost, it's a de-stressor. It can help reduce stress. I think mainly because it's going to inherently take your mind off of whatever stressor is in your life. So you can look like that, look at it as beneficial just because it's taking stress, it's removing stress from your life. I think sometimes, when you have those short reads, those clip reads, sometimes that can stress you out because it's potentially political or, something that's sad. It's going to make you stressed out because it's sad, or it's going to frustrate you because some idiot's doing something stupid again. So generally, I think that's when you're reading news. That's one of the risks you take of reading the news is having it potentially stress you out. But reading for fun, reading something that's fictional, that can often help reduce stress because it's going to put you in a different state of mind. Now, obviously, I said it's helping to increase your knowledge. It's developmentally building your brain. If you think about it, you're learning new words, you're building your vocabulary, you may be learning about new things that you didn't know existed, or new ways of life, or new civilizations on the planet Narifia, the planet of Narifia. That's not a real thing, but it also can help improve your linguistic abilities. If you think about it in terms of focusing on something that's going to help improve your career, being able to speak better is always going to help you in any kind of career, because as much as you want to say, well, I can get by just doing what I need, keeping my nose clean, keeping my mouth shut, I guess if you're working on a factory floor, that's possible. But even that, if you want to be able to move up and get into management, you got to be able to talk to people. So you need to find ways to improve your linguistic intelligence. And it can also help build your mathematical intelligence. Although I saw that and I kind of questioned it, unless maybe the book is about stuff to do with mathematics, like you're reading about reading the novel A Beautiful Mind or something. Not entirely sure about that one, but I'm gonna go with it. I'm gonna say you're gonna become a math genius just by reading. And the subtle disclaimer is that nothing that I say has any bearing outside of the walls of an insane asylum. So, the other thing, it can help improve your spatial intelligence, which I think, from a perspective of expanding your knowledge and making you aware of what's going on in the world, and, in general, just improving your knowledge of existence and your place in life. I think I take that as something that's going to just culture you more. It's going to expand your depth of knowledge. It's going to make you more interesting at parties, for sure. It's always kind of cool to be in the middle of a conversation or walk into the middle of a conversation and know what someone's talking about, because maybe you read a book that was related to that discussion. It's just kind of a cool feeling to just have knowledge. And, I think having the strong vocabulary is probably one of the biggest benefits in my opinion. I think that, building your word knowledge is important. Having an extensive vocabulary, it just can actually improve your stage in life. I think you don't go very far if you don't sound like you somewhat are intelligent. I think it's kind of a shame that Ebonics took on this pop culture place in life. I don't know how to put my finger quite on it, but it got popularized in a way that made it seem like it was cool to be speaking in Ebonics as if it were a language that, essentially was something that you learned, and that should be perceived as making you smarter for some reason because you know it. But it's not like learning Mandarin. I'll tell you that much. And as much as I spoke it a ton when I was younger, and I was growing up in that generation of being into rap and being into hip hop, I think it just doesn't make you sound very good. I don't think you want to go to an interview for a job and speak Ebonics and speak in a way that just doesn't seem like you can demonstrate your intelligence. I think English is the main language across the planet, and that's what you should adapt to. You should be able to know how to use it well. Doesn't mean that when you're with your friends or you're in the right situation that you shouldn't be speaking, just because that's your laid back conversationalist, choice, language of choice. It just is something that you need to be a little bit more adept at reading the situation and understanding when it's appropriate to not speak intelligently, and when it's okay, when it's acceptable, when you're just hanging out with your friends or something like that. I think if you are going to a job in the United States, then it's pretty much a given that you're going to want to have a solid understanding of the English language and be able to speak English intelligently. If you're going to a job interview in Japan, you should know Japanese. And if you're going somewhere in China, you should know Chinese, Mandarin, whatever it is. But I think what you need is to have a solid understanding of what the preferred language of wherever you are. If you happen to be going to apply for a position for a job where they prefer you speak Ebonics, then by all means, then leverage your talent for being able to speak Ebonics. But my point is, most of the time when you're applying for a job, or you're trying to network with somebody to get further with your own personal businesses, or just building out your own personal relationships, you want to be able to adapt to whatever is culturally acceptable for that scenario. And the bottom line is, reading is how you essentially develop that baseline and how you build out that foundation of knowledge. And it's very important for you to recognize that. And so it kind of comes back, as I try to tie a bow on this, to reading is fundamental, because it's the fundamental basis of survival, in a sense. It's the fundamental basis for building knowledge. It's the fundamental basis for developing in a personal or in a professional manner. And it's super easy. I mean, unless you don't know how to read because for whatever reason, you haven't been able to learn how to read. And by all means, you should do what you can to learn to read. I think it's great that you can have audiobooks now and podcasts, but I still do think that should be a high value for visually reading. And unless there's obviously a disability involved, if you're blind, you need everything to be auditory in order to consume information. But there is proven studies that have shown that visually reading words with your eyes, consuming that information by reading into your brain, will help with your cognitive development. And I think it's important to recognize that, and that it's a strength, and it's free. I mean, if anything, you should look at it like this is a free activity. You can go to the library in pretty much any part of the United States. I'm not sure about other countries. I would assume they have libraries there, but you can go to the library and you can take out a book for free, and you can consume the knowledge and build your cognitive skills and do all this for free. and it's a free activity, and free is great, and you should always take advantage of that. And so, a couple other big factors for why you should read. It helps increase your memory skills. It helps build out your writing skills. If it comes to finding a job for career purposes, you definitely want strong writing skills, because you need to be able to communicate orally and in a written form. It's something that you'll find is going to give you greater value, especially during any communication that you need to, in a big corporate environment. Any of that communication that needs to be through email, which is mostly through email, I should say. Maybe it's a post on some kind of messaging platform, if it's, in a blog form or something to that extent. But, writing skills are very important. And, I think lastly, you're going to improve your focus and concentration skills when it comes to reading, because you're going to figure out how to calm yourself down to a state where you can focus on reading and concentrate on what you're reading and absorb what you're reading, because that's very important, that you can actually absorb what you're reading and walk away from it remembering what you've read. I think that's the biggest, enjoyment of it, is being able to remember that great story that you read, or the great advice that you got from that nonfiction self-help writer. So, I think that's very, very important. And I think the last thing that I'm going to leave you with before I end this episode is what I found on lifehacker.com, but it was an article, and I'm just going to quote it. It was from actually in April 2019 under a lifestyle story, but I think it was, I actually don't remember the title, but I think it was the 10 best reasons for reading. But it said, one of the biggest reasons why we read books is to gain knowledge. Books are a rich source of information. Reading books on varied subjects, whether you read a book, you learn new information that otherwise you would not have known. I think the same can be said about listening to a podcast too. But this episode is about you getting out there and reading and not listening to more podcasts. But, you got to balance that stuff out, because you got to get back to finding your identity. Listen to all the previous episodes if you haven't, or listening to upcoming episodes, because I will have, I think, one more episode about working on yourself, and that will be coming up next for episode 14. But I just want to thank you again for listening to Finding Your Identity and this episode about reading. I hope that you can find some books that you enjoy reading and get out there, or cozy up in the corner of the comfortable part of the couch and read some books. And until next time, thanks for listening.